Hi, I'm Sterling Edwards. Thank you for joining me. We're going to paint a barn. Let's face it, everybody likes old barns. They have so much character and so much charm. And depending on where you live in the country, they also vary in style and size. Now, I'm from North Carolina. We have just lots of old tobacco barns, and some of these barns are 150, 200 years old. And they have so much character because the roof lines are leaning, the walls are leaning, the hinges are rusty. There's so much you can do with a barn, and especially if you use some creative colors. Now, most of these barns are brown or gray. But if you look at gray wood, especially that silvery gray wood on a sunny day, if you really take a look at it, you'll see lots of color. You'll see beautiful lavenders and greens and mauve colors in it. Because the spectrum of light, when it hits that silver wood, it just kind of breaks down a little bit, and you get these beautiful nuances of color. I'm going to try to exaggerate that in this painting. Now, the main thing you have to remember when you're painting a barn or a cityscape or anything architectural, more so than in a typical landscape, you've got to be aware where your light is coming from. Part of what makes this barn painting work is knowing where the light is. So I've got to have, for example, if I have an eave, the eave is going to be casting the shadow down the front of the barn depending on where the light is. And the other thing to remember is once you put that first shadow in that barn, you're committed. You told the viewer right then where the light is coming from, so you got to be consistent throughout the painting. I've seen lots of paintings where you got a shadow here and a shadow coming this way and a shadow going that way. And it implies that there's multiple light sources. We're going to try to eliminate that, narrow ourselves down to just one light source, and then have fun with shapes and colors. So I've got a piece of 140-pound paper. This is 140-pound Fabriano cold-pressed paper. And I have it taped down to a gator board, which is just a very lightweight mounting board, with plain masking tape. Now, before I start the barn, let's take a look at some of the brushes and things we're going to be using. The brushes I'll use for this piece are just a nice assortment of flat brushes. I've got a 1/2 inch, a 1 inch, and a 2 inch flat nylon brush. These are brushes I designed, by the way. They're very slim profiles. They don't hold too much water, but they have a very, very fine edge. And they're ideal for painting architectural things because you get these very clean, sharp edges. I'll also be using a couple of these. These are also brushes I designed. These are very stiff bristle. They're wonderful for blending edges, painting grass, applying heavy glazes of color. A lot of versatility. And I'll probably also be using a rigger brush. This is a very, very long, very slim brush, and this is a number 6 rigger. It comes with a set of brushes I designed. Now, if we look at the palette, the colors I'll be using for this, these are all My Mary Blue colors. My Mary Blue is an Italian paint. It's wonderful colors, and these are all transparent colors. Now, I want to have lots of color in this barn, so let's have a little bit of, this color is called cupric green. That's C-U-P-R-I-C, cupric green. Let's have some primary red magenta. And as you see, I'm just mixing up various washes of colors. Very, very thin, very watery. Let's have a little bit of violet. And let's put a little bit of blue in this. Now, we're not going to do a whole landscape. We're going to paint just a barn. But there's enough color right here to give us a pretty good idea where we're going. Now, let's mix one more color. Let's take some brown. This is a color called brown still to grain. It's very clean, very transparent brown. So we have a nice variety of colors to go with now. We might put a tree behind the barn or something just to kind of help close it in and give it almost a vignette kind of look. Now, before I start that, let's take a look at the other tools we have. We have 2 containers for water. One is clean water, which I keep clean at all times. I use that to introduce clean water to my painting. This water, as you can see, I wash my brushes in. Now, this tool right here is the best tool you can have on your whole table. That's a roll of toilet tissue with paper towel wrapped around it. And I use that to get the excess water out of my brush. You don't want to take a really wet load of paint and drop it on a wet shape, because if you do, it's going to just run everywhere. You get those bad blossoms. So we just kind of blot it on that to get the excess water out. The other tools I use are just a Kleenex, and I have just a regular 4H drawing pencil, and I have a kneaded eraser for erasing lines. Let's just draw a barn kind of based on what we think a barn might look like. We're not really trying to do anything too complicated, because this is just a very fast little demo, but let's just set a barn coming up right here, and I'm really just kind of ad-lib. I'm not looking at a photograph, because we're going to just imagine what this barn looks like. And I'm putting a really crooked roof on that barn on purpose. Nobody wants to paint a new barn. We want these old barns because they have so much character. And it also has a little shed coming off the side like so. It also, if you notice, the angles are very strong diagonal lines. Everything's kind of leaning a little bit. Well, this is all done by design because it makes the piece much more interesting. And we'll have a big tree back here just to kind of give this barn a little more interest. So it'll be a big tree behind it, lots of grass growing up around it. And I think I'll also have a little appendage sticking off on this side. Just a real simple little shape of barn. It's almost kind of playful looking, but that's all we need for this demonstration. So we've decided now we want to paint this, but we need to make a decision, first of all, where is our light coming from? Because one of these sides of this barn is going to be darker than the others, which is going to tell us where our light is coming from. Let's have the light coming from up here. Now, when I'm working on a serious painting, quite often I will take a pencil or a pen, and on the tape, where I've taped my paper down, I'll draw that arrow, just to remind myself of my light source. In this case, I'm just drawing it here so everybody can see it. So we know the light is coming in almost like this. It's hitting this side of the building. It'll hit this. Lots of this will be in the shadow. Even though that's going to be in the shadow, we can still play with color, make it very colorful. We're going to leave some white paper over here, implying that the light is really hitting the side of that barn and giving it lots of luminosity. So let's start this piece with a 1-inch flat brush. And let's start taking some of these very light pastel colors. I'm mixing a little bit of the magenta and the cyan blue. Now this is the side of the barn that's facing the sunlight. Okay, so we're just putting just a little bit of color on here. And I'm going to take some clear water and kind of blend that out a little bit. And while that's still wet, we're dropping a little bit of the magenta into it. This is one of the wonderful things about watercolors, the way the colors just kind of take off and do their own thing. I'm also an oil painter and an acrylic painter, and I would just give anything if I could get those to work the way watercolors do. These just work so beautifully. So now we have a little bit of color in the side of that barn. Now that's going to dry back very light. Remember, when you use watercolor, you're going to lose about 30% of your color intensity after it dries. Watercolors will fool you. And there's an old saying on watercolor, if it looks right, it's wrong. When you put it on, if that's the way you want it to look, you better jump in right then and put some more color in it, because you will lose quite a bit of that. Now the shadow side of the barn, let's take a little bit of the violet, right in here, for example. And we're not going too dark too quick. We have plenty of time to add dark color to this thing. But right now we're just trying to get some color going that's going to help us kind of establish where the shapes are. There's violet. Here's a little bit of the green. Now this is going to make a nice pretty blue, which is going to kind of push that back into the shadows. Let's take a little bit of the brown. This is distilled to grain brown. I'm putting a little bit of brown in here and kind of working into it very slowly, letting it all kind of run. So you've got the browns running into the greens, which hit the violets and turn blue. Just a nice color range. Now here's something I want you to really pay attention to, is this bottom edge of the barn. We don't want this barn to look like we just cut it out of one painting and pasted it on top of another. We want the bottom of the barn to be soft in a few places. That lets the eye go straight from the grass up into the shape of the barn. So I'm always looking for ways to come in and just soften a couple edges. And let that color come right down into the grass. Now the barn and the grass look as though they've been growing together for quite some time. I'm taking a barely damp brush, softening a few edges. And while we're at it, let's also put just a little shadow, because the light's coming in like this. You can see some shadow out here beside the barn. And again, let's take that bottom edge, soften that a little bit. Looks very candy-like. It's very colorful, which is good, because we're going to come back and put some darks in here in a few minutes, and we're going to try to save some of these pretty colors. Now, before we do that, we've got to let it dry, but I'm going to let this dry by itself for the most part. And while I'm waiting for that to dry, let's put a tree back here. Now, the tree is going to help frame in the roof line of the barn. It's going to create a negative shape. In other words, we're going to paint the suggestion of a roof without actually painting the roof. We're painting a dark behind it. That will give the impression of light hitting this metal roof. So let's just take some of that still to grain brown and some of the green. Give me a nice earthy color. I'm still using the 1-inch flat brush, and I'm framing out the edge of that barn. Now this is one of the reasons why I like the flat brushes so much. It's one of the reasons why I designed my brushes with this very sharp edge, because I can come in here now and really kind of cut into these shapes. It's almost like chiseling a piece of granite. We need to put a little fence post or two. Notice how that frames out the building. Negative painting is a very powerful tool with watercolor particularly. Up here at the top of the tree, we're going to do just a little bit of squiggles with it, just kind of just scumbling, give it a nice leafy look. Now if you have a chance, there's a free lesson on how to paint trees using the Scumbling technique. Be sure to look at that. It'll give you some really good ideas on how to paint a tree using these various techniques. So I use the sharp edge of the brush to carve out around the barn. I use the Scumbling technique to get some texture to the tree, nice leafy textures, holding the brush where it just kind of just barely rests on the surface. So I have the back of the barn and the roof of the barn framed out now. Now these areas right here, we may have to stop just for a second and turn the dryer on to dry these. But before I do, let's see if we can't put a little bit more color in this barn before we turn the dryer on. For example, the roof, right up in here, I'm putting just a little bit of color. This is the violet. Kind of pulling it down. This is all very wet, so I want to stay out of that. Because if I hit this with a wet brush, it's going to kind of run a little bit. But I am going to soften an edge or two. Now by softening an edge, I'm taking my brush is barely damp, and I'm very lightly just touching that edge. So the tree and the barn kind of become one continuous shape. It allows the eye to come from the tree into the barn, or from the barn out to the tree. These little soft passages are so important in a painting, just like down here. We don't want too many hard lines that make the eye stop. Hard lines say, stop and look at me. I demand attention. Soft lines let the eye move from one shape or color to the next. So these little soft passages like these allow the eye to kind of move through the painting. Using a little bit darker colors, put just a little bit more dark up in here. And let's put just a little bit under here. This is where the main roof line is casting a shadow down this little small shed. And right there's a little soft passage. I didn't even mean to do that, but then it just happened because that wet brush hit that paper. So there's a little soft passage takes you from this right up into this, and then this takes you right over here, and this takes you right down into here. There's a little soft passage let the eye kind of just walk through the painting. Now let's stop for 1 second and dry this before we go any further. We want to make sure we have plenty of time to get some darks in here to really accentuate where that sunlight is. But before I dry it, let's take the bevel end of this brush. Now that's a very fat bevel. Let's take a smaller brush. This is a number 8 round, or number 12 round. It's got that beveled edge, and we can use that almost like we're spreading butter. You can also use a pocket knife, but I prefer the brush. And I'm waiting for this to kind of lose the shine, and just as it does, we're going to go in there and scrape in a few tree trunks. Now if I do this when it's too shiny, it's just not going to work. If I do it when it's too dry, it's not going to work. So it's a matter of timing. I see that it's still kind of wet, so I'm waiting for it to lose that shine a little bit. Then we'll go in there and do some quick scraping on it. So it is a thing where you have to really kind of just time it and play it by ear. So let's try it now. It looks a little bit better. Just a few suggestions of trees. It's a little thing, but it's these little touches like this that kind of give a piece a little more credibility. We knew that was a tree. We didn't have to do that, but it just gives me a chance to show a technique, and it also gives a viewer a chance to better determine what that shape is. Now we know for sure it's a tree. So let's stop for 1 second and dry this, then we'll finish this demo. But let's review first where we've gone so far. We started out leaving some white paper, which is the sunlight hitting the building. These are very light pastel shades of green, blue. Here I've got some primary red magenta, a little bit of violet. Here's some of the brown. The brown goes over into the green blue, which goes into the violet. There's just a lot of color in this little barn so far, and we have a very strong sense of light coming in, which we're going to enhance in a few minutes. And then of course we have the big tree behind it and a few little fence posts. So let's stop for 1 second, I'll dry this, and I'll be right back. We're back. We have some dry paper. Now let's see if we can't really accentuate these shadows. Just to repeat a little bit, you notice I did leave the white paper. Now I'm a transparent watercolorist. White paper to me is my white paint if I were an oil painter. So if I want to have something really have the impression of sunlight shining on it, I've got to leave some white paper. And it really does benefit the painting because when you get these little white passages like this of the light hitting the building or the fence post or anything else, it's a beautiful, clean, white neutral from which to judge all the colors in the painting. And I didn't always do that, but since I started leaving the white paper in my paintings, I've seen my work just look brighter and more invigorated. So I really believe in leaving some white. Now let's come back now with our sunlight coming from this way. And let's really see if we can accentuate some of these shadows. So I'm taking a darker mix of some of the brown and the violet and the blue. I'm making a nice rich dark. And let's paint the underside of this eave. Now we know that the eave is definitely out of the light. And while we're at it, we're also going to paint a little eave right in here. Let's give it some character. Let's move it around a little bit, like the sheet metal's kind of coming loose in a few places. And we're going to bring it right down across this side, right around that roof line. I don't want to cover all that pretty green-blue color up, so I'm putting just a little bit of the dark, then I'm taking a brush and kind of blending it in. Let's put a little bit under here. The idea is to tell a story by giving the viewer enough information they can make their own decisions. I stress that in almost all my little free demonstrations and my DVDs, because that's an important part of painting, is giving the viewer just enough information to make up their mind what that is. We don't have to spell everything out for them. Now I'm taking a number 6 rigger. I'm just suggesting a few individual boards. Down at the bottom, I can kind of blend them out a little bit. In fact, I'm actually using my finger for this time. And it's not necessary to paint every single board. What's necessary is to let the viewer know that those are boards. Put a little more dark into this eave. Now this eave right here, even though the underside of the eave is dark, but the eave also casts a shadow on the side of the building. So let's take the 1/2-inch brush and let's take some of this darker violet mix and come right in here and paint that cast shadow. And I'm also going to give that shadow just a little crook in it, which again kind of helps add a little character to it. Now we're starting to get a barn. The roof here can take just a little tiny bit of the brown, just almost looking like it's just an old metal roof. I can put a little bit over here just for fun, really, just kind of bring that color in a little bit, without getting too overzealous with the paint. Now we can come in with a darker color and start putting a few boards on the front. We can also put a door in the front. And I'm just using the number 6 rigger. And I'm also going to put a little smokestack right there. If I want a window, very easy to paint a window. Just take a rigger brush and paint 4 small little squares. Kind of leans on the cute side, but it's just a demo. Now when I'm doing a real serious painting of a barn, I try to put a bit more into it as far as textures and so forth, but the idea works the same. These techniques really work. Now since we're just playing with this thing, let's also take the bristle brush. This is a stiff bristle brush. Let's put a little bit of grass. There's a free art lesson on how to paint grass using this brush. If you have a chance, I think you'll enjoy it. But in the meantime, let's just see if we can't put just a little bit of grass around the base of this barn. Laying that brush almost parallel to the paper and pulling up. Very lightly. I'm not putting any pressure on that brush at all, hardly. It's just almost just the weight of the brush. And I could also come in there with the same brush that's clean and pull down and soften a little bit. So it just takes on a nice, fresh, clean watercolor look. Now the only thing else this painting needs, and I don't have to even do this, but I'm going to do it just for illustration purposes, is to take a nice dark, bring a few tree branches up here into the sky, through these little holes in the tree. To to kind of help complete the image. It's a very simple little scene. It's a very simple little scene with a little bit of color. We know that's an old gray barn, but at least now it has a little bit of life to it. And the last thing I'm going to do is put just a little shadow. My sun's coming in like this, so that little smokestack's casting a little shadow coming down the roof. And there you have it. It's a very simple little painting of a barn with lots of color, lots of light, a tree with some scumbled edges, and some pretty textured grass. Very simple little scene, but it's fun to paint. I hope you'll try one. If you have a chance, look at my website, sterlingedwards.com, and be sure to look at the calendar page. I have a lot of workshops scheduled all across the U.S. and Canada, and I'd love to have a chance to meet you someday. Maybe you'll find one near you. Thank you very much.